Fun facts about rhetoric. So I'm covering and your notes will need to cover the major theorists, conceptions of rhetoric, and canons of rhetoric are all combined, and they still provide information on the theorists, so you'll want to go back. I am going to point out some things that I want to make sure that you saw in the notes, because I think it's a really important thing to know and to recognize about rhetorical theory development. And so this video, I'm going to keep it as short as possible to just highlight I want to make sure you saw this. So what we see at the very beginning of this, and then this influenced American history so profoundly, rhetoric was a foundational subject in public education. Public education existed, it doesn't look like it does now, but public education existed in Greek times, and it was very heavily connected to citizenship, just as it is in America. We think that literacy is fundamental to citizenship. Every eligible voter needs to be educated so that they can make an educated vote. Still our belief system today. Greeks had a different conception of who was eligible, but that's a different conversation. Okay, so when Harvard was founded as the first institution in America, one of the first classes that they put on the books, a rhetoric class, for the exact same reasons. Rhetoric and rhetorical theory education has been foundational in public education for the history of public education, which is basically the history of Western civilization. Rhetoric's kind of awesome like that. Gorgias, who is one of the sophists, and we know most about Gorgias from texts on Plato and from Plato railing against him. Plato clearly has admires. We'll go with admires. Plato admires Gorgias, but he still is very anti the sophists, and Gorgias is a sophist. And the sophists' view of rhetorical theory and that truth is relative, that is not what Plato believes. But what Gorgias pointed out, and this is really important, is that there is a gap between a word and what they mean. And we see this all of the time. I mean, think about a time where you've texted something, and I text while I walk, and I shouldn't because I'm a terrible texter while I walk, and the message is completely lost. I've used the wrong word, I've misspelled something, and they can't figure out what it is, and I get a what back. The distance, and I know that in that case it's miscommunication, but there is a huge gap between words and what they mean and what they look like. If we talk about a table, if you're living in a dorm right now, a table looks a certain way in your head and you have this idea of what it is, but I have a child, and so when I say table, I think of the kitchen table where we have family dinner, and other parents may think the same way, or we may have other conceptions of what a table is. And so even the word table, lots of cultural meanings, and that was Gorgias's point. So I want to point that out because that is really important when we get to contemporary, especially the connection with linguistics. So in chapter 3, when we start getting into belletristic letters, we start developing the idea of what is linguistics, and this is a whole field. We're really starting from Gorgias, that there's a distance between words and meanings. Socrates' death increased Plato's skepticism about democracy and rhetoric, and he saw those two things as intertwined, and that's really important. Democracy as a people-led government meant that the people who were leading needed to be educated, and the foundation of that education was rhetoric. And if rhetorical theory and rhetorical education was focused on teaching people to persuade, Plato became very skeptical of what that meant for the long-term health of democracy. Always seeing them as connected, which means citizenship is also always connected to that, which very foundational to American history. Harvard was established to educate in literacy the founding fathers' children so that they can then continue the democracy that is America, and rhetoric was one of the subjects that they started teaching. Aristotle, modes of persuasion, they kind of gloss over it a little bit. I'm assuming you know these. Ethos, pathos, logos. Logos is logical appeals, pathos, emotional appeals, ethos, the ethics of the person. Keep in mind, these are invention techniques. I use ethos, pathos, and logos to form an argument, not to analyze. And this is so, so, so important. We are not analyzing anything. We are teaching rhetorical practices so you can be effective. We have no measure and no way to talk about effectiveness at this point. And we are conceptualizing what is rhetoric and what does it mean, because that's as far as we've gotten with education and with understanding teaching, basically, at this point. Isocrates. So I know Isocrates was not a great speaker, but he is the father of the 5-paragraph essay. And I love this fact because it just The 5-paragraph essay has been around since ancient Greek times. Like, this just boggles my mind because I hate the 5-paragraph essay. It's the worst. But Socrates conceives of an argument, and a structured argument, especially in writing, because he was a much more effective writer, as needing a head, a body, and a foot, which is the basic structure of the 5-paragraph essay. Cicero was a non-citizen who gained citizenship, and so his conception of rhetorical theory is very different because he was able to gain personhood and be accepted, not open to everybody. And so his is really connected to government and democracy and power because he gained citizenship. Quintilian focuses heavily on ability because he kind of struggled with that piece, and he was also seeing Greek turn into Roman culture, and then, if you know your history, we end up with democracy going away. Oh my goodness, words. After Quintilian, we get the Rhetoric ad Herennium. We're not really sure who the author is. It's probably a whole bunch of notes. What's really important is the Rhetorica starts to lay out an approach to education. So, like, the manuals that I would read about how to be a better teacher, the Rhetorica starts to talk about some of that, but also, like, prime students to use it. And so they talk about learning rhetoric as needing theory, imitation, and practice, which is the very first curriculum to ever have been captured, Rhetoric ad Herennium. Finally, the 5 canons of rhetoric: invention, arrangement, style, delivery, memory. They are all interconnected, and they are all for the production of a text. They fall apart very heavily, and it doesn't have to be, I mean, I'm using text broadly, for the production of, here I have a Yeti, the production of how this tells you something about me. I bet you can guess my favorite color. You know, stuff like that. That's where text doesn't have to just be words. It's whatever is communicative. It is not for critique. If you have questions about these, this video got long, so sorry. If you have questions about any of these, you send me an email, come to office hours, and we'll talk them through.